Okay, if I could have your attention, please. My name is Jeff Kugler, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Urban Schooling. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening on behalf of the Center for Urban Schooling. As we begin this evening, we would like to acknowledge that we are presently located on the traditional lands of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. The name Toronto means meeting place, as this region was also the meeting place of many other First Nations peoples who use this land. And now I have to tell you some news. Before I begin, I need to let you all know that our plan for this evening has by necessity become a very flexible one. And as you are all teachers or educators, we all know that shit happens. Thank you. And then when shit happens, we all figure out a way to make it work. So earlier today, within the last few hours, we were informed that Professor Banks' direct flight from Seattle to Toronto made an emergency landing in Vancouver, as a passenger on board suffered a heart attack. So we have to think about that. His arrival was therefore delayed. At first, it appeared that he was going to arrive on time for his talk this evening. Later, like shortly later, with yet another delay leaving Vancouver, it became clear to us that he was not going to make it this evening. So that's the news that I was dreading telling. But as educators, we know that we move on. And we're really sorry for this, but there's no way around it. We're, however, really fortunate that Judy Rebick was and is our other keynote. And she will make this evening more than worthwhile for us all. My first task this evening is to thank William and Phyllis Waters and their generosity, without which none of this would be possible. Please let's all acknowledge William and Phyllis. He's not here tonight. Thank you. The Center for Urban Schooling at OISE-UT was created in 2005, in particular, to work to support the most racialized and marginalized students within our urban context. We have a record of doing just that, through research projects such as Proyecto Latino, research and professional development with teachers and administrators around the theoretical and practical applications of culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy within the Toronto context. Forums and advocacy, including our Forum on Equity and Social Justice in Education, which for the last 2 years has been a partnership with the Toronto District School Board Aboriginal Education Centre, focusing on the issues and experiences of Aboriginal students within the urban context. We're also really pleased with the development of our resource, Equity Continuum, Action for Critical Transformation in Schools and Classrooms, which we are thrilled to say has just about sold out of its first printing run. However, because you're here, there are still a few copies available at the different book list table just outside. We believe that the Center is playing a special role in the struggle to build an education system that is reflective and responsive to the students in attendance, and one that speaks for the most marginalized students in our schools. We believe that as an outside academic body, we are able to speak up on issues of inequity connected to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other identity areas. We at the Center will continue the battle that has gone on for many years by the many brave fighters who have engaged in this work over time. So long as racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, etc., impact the experiences of students in our schools, we commit to the ongoing struggles. Every morning over the PA system as principal at Nelson Mandela School, I repeated a quote from Nelson Mandela, among other quotes from Nelson Mandela, with all students and staff repeating together. It was kind of our Pledge of Allegiance, and it went, "Education is the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world." It is through our understandings of that notion from Nelson Mandela and those issues in general that the topic and focus for tonight's symposium developed. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Gallagher, the academic director at the Center for Urban Schooling, to introduce tonight's topic, Activism in Education, Pushing Limits in Increasingly Conservative Times. Just one sec. And I guess now the topic is really Occupy Education. This is the last William Waters Symposium that Kathleen Gallagher will introduce, as Kathleen is stepping down from her position as academic director of the center, a post she has held since the creation of the center. We will all miss Kathleen in this role, but know that she will continue to work as a close friend to the Center for Urban Schooling in the future. Please join me in thanking her for all of her work at the center over the years. It's also my pleasure to announce that Professor Lance McCready, over there, go like that, is the new director of the Center for Urban Schooling. Please join. I'll just say you don't have to clap again if you don't want to. Please join me in welcoming him to this new role. You could clap. And finally, before Kathleen comes up, a very special thank you to this year's William Waters Teacher in Resident in Urban Education, Vanessa Russell, for her incredible... You could join me again. For her incredible strength, organization, and vision in making this symposium what it is and will be over the next few days. For Vanessa, And the one other thing I just want to say is that for people, there are workshops over the next few days that people have pre-registered for, and they're full. But I just want people to know that the James Banks workshops that are taking place Thursday and Friday will take place, because he's arriving just as we finish tonight. So thank you, and here's Kathleen.
Good evening and welcome. So the focus of our public lecture tonight is activism in education, pushing limits in increasingly conservative times. A time when the BBC is reporting that communication of vital research on health and the environment is being suppressed by the Canadian government. When activist leaders like David Suzuki are resigning from their positions in order to retain their voices, when new regulations threaten to silence them. A time also when the negotiations between ministries of education and educators across the globe and in our local context have taken a very uncertain turn. A familiar distrust of all things public returns. In such an age of micromanagement of the public good, the response is often greater and stronger forms of activism. Informed discussion is a matter of the future of the planet, and when growing social disparities risk tearing apart any sense of local or global cohesion, citizens are provoked to speak up for what it is they believe in, what it is they stand for, and sometimes at great personal cost. Education, like other historically guaranteed social provisions, cannot be taken for granted. The voices of activists, working within and outside public institutions, continue to imagine a public good and a welfare state where private interests do not trump public values. In both the global north and south, income levels are a primary determinant of educational opportunity and achievement. The driver of the economy, especially in these times of global economic instability, argues that quality of learning, and not years in school, is the marker we should be most concerned to measure. The last decade, globally speaking, has seen too many failures in attempts to improve educational outcomes, and too little improvement in reducing the inequities in those outcomes across socioeconomic, gender, and racial differences. Tonight we'll have the opportunity to hear one, that's a change, luminary, an activist working in and across many institutions, who has created public and pedagogical languages to describe our changing social and educational contexts and to insist upon the public we deserve. As our speakers understand well, education remains one of the most difficult parts of attempting to reform the public sector. Since education is directly related to the health of a society, we are called to make explicit the connection between an equitably educated public, a healthy economy, and a thriving democracy. Dr. William Waters, as Jeff mentioned, is a friend and a stalwart supporter of the Center for Urban Schooling. He's made this 5th annual William and Phyllis Waters Symposium on Urban Education possible. From our very earliest conversations with Dr. Waters, it was clear to us that he was someone who understood the value of rich educational opportunities in economically disadvantaged communities. A professor emeritus from the Faculty of Business, he had never forgotten the value of educational opportunity in his own life, and when he was in a position to do so, he enthusiastically supported such opportunities for children and for teachers. For his insights and generosity, we are most grateful. Dr. Waters understands, as many of us here do, that effective teaching should be at the very center of our thinking about educational achievement for young people. So a tradition begun 2 years ago, Dr. Waters supports students with generous scholarships who are committed urban school teachers to return to Oise and take a master's degree in order to refresh and challenge their thinking about their practice and its implications for the students they work with in inner-city schools. This year we have 4 very deserving urban teachers, and I'd just like to introduce them to you and ask if they wouldn't mind standing when their name is called, because someone in this room wants to take your picture. So, as a middle school teacher in the TDSB, Natasha Burford. There she is. Started a young women's program. She also manages a community-based initiative to coordinate educational resources and social services for racialized youth who have not completed high school. Her research will focus on examining the opportunity gap, especially for young mothers. Sarah Papoff is hiding. I'm going to tell you about her anyway. Is an elementary teacher since 1998, and she wishes to investigate how the arts impact critical thinking and social justice pedagogies. She's used the arts in her classroom to explore the effects of globalization, racism, colonization, and child labor on young lives. Danielle Blair is also hiding with Sarah, is a high school teacher, and she intends to research how students from economically disadvantaged neighborhoods balance academic success and personal responsibilities. And she hopes this study will help her to further advocate for her Jane Finch community. And Amanda Paris, I won't say it, has garnered her classroom experience from her alternative education organization called Lost Lyrics, through which she has created curriculum with students, activists, and artists. In her research, she will explore the experiences of alienation in formal education institutions felt by many young people from the African diaspora. So we welcome them and wish them every success. As the outgoing academic director of the Center for Urban Schooling, I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank my colleagues, students, and our community partners at the Center for a very full and important 7 years. And I would like to close with the ever-insightful words of Rick Salutin in his final essay on public education for the Toronto Star in 2011, called "What is Public About Public Education?" He wrote, "Canadians have tended to define ourselves as a society in terms of public health care, and that is an achievement to take pride in. But public education is an accomplishment on a different level. Healthcare is biological. It's about survival on a physical level, and it's similar for people everywhere. Education is more specific and social. It's how we define the way we are, not simply that we are." Thanks.
Hello. I want to personally welcome you to the 2012 William Waters Symposium. I'm Vanessa Russell, and as Jeff said, I'm the William Waters Teacher in Residence in Urban Education at OISE. A major piece of my work has been to organize this 3-day symposium, and I just want to say thank goodness for the village of support I had at OISE, especially in light of the news we got today. It's thrilling to see so many of you out here. Before we hear from our distinguished presenter, Judy Rebeck, I have the privilege to introduce my former colleague and friend, Louise Azzarello, a teacher at Oasis Alternative Secondary School. To provide a bit of a context, Oasis opened its doors in the early 1990s. The school's raison d'etre is to re-engage students who are the most poorly served by the education system. Those who have felt the deep and enduring impact of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and ableism, many of whom are in conflict with the law, homeless, have mental health struggles, and/or live in poverty. Oasis is a school that offers 3 unique and precious satellite programs. The Triangle program, still Canada's only secondary school classroom for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students. The Oasis Skateboard Factory, where students learn to engage in socially responsible entrepreneurship, creating street art and building skateboards. And the Oasis Arts and Social Change program, which delivers an arts-based social justice curriculum and pedagogy. Tonight, Louise will highlight some of the incredible activist work of the students and teachers at the Arts and Social Change program, perhaps the least well-known of the satellites of Oasis. Louise has taught in a number of Toronto District School Board schools, working with racialized and marginalized youth in a variety of urban educational environments. 3 of these have been alternative schools. Louise's activism has taken many forms, designing curriculum that embeds issues of equity and social justice, advocating for students, mentoring young teachers, and fighting for change within the system. Louise was a member of the West Hill Equity Committee that embarked on a 3-year process to have the Indian Head school logo changed to comply with TDSB equity policies. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce Louise Azzarello, a teacher who embodies courage, especially in these increasingly conservative times.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Centre for Urban Schooling for inviting me to consider the impact that increasingly conservative practices are having on alternative education and to present activist work done by students and staff at Oasis Arts and Social Change Satellite. I'm honored to be part of an event with James Banks and Judy Rebeck, both who, without knowing it, have contributed to my own activism. In my early years of feminist activism, Judy Rebeck was always there to inspire, lead, and critique, while James Banks' scholarship on anti-oppression curriculum informs my work daily. My activism in schools comes out of rage, excitement, despair, and hope. During my career, I have witnessed a shift from a progressive educational system to a conservative, hierarchical system where all aspects of education and schooling are to be measured, codified, and packaged, where constraints are imposed by funding formulas that are inequitable, where loss of jobs puts marginalized and racialized youth more at risk and limit their opportunities for success, where expertise is asserted depending on the position you hold rather than your experience, pedagogical practices, or knowledge. Thank you. Where many of our leaders in positions of responsibility no longer function as educators, but are managers looking to impose the bottom line. Where student success is often measured only in terms of credit accumulation, when all of us here tonight know it is so much more. We are working in contradictory reality, where our legislation and policies profess a liberating, equitable educational philosophy, while the system is being stripped of its resources and has become more dependent on domesticating disciplinary and standardized practices. To create an equitable learning environment, we must be willing to disrupt the effects of these conservative practices. Teaching is not a neutral act. As educators, we must provide all students, no matter what the educational setting, access to curriculum that is critical, relevant, challenging, and connected to the hard work of activism and social transformation. In the past, this is what alternative schools did. Toronto alternative schools, each with their own unique framework, provided diverse environments, curriculum, and opportunities for a range of students for who a multitude of reasons were not engaging in schooling in traditional settings. Each of the long-established alternative schools have histories connected to community, curriculum and pedagogies that were based in educational activism and social justice. Yet today, this history seems to be forgotten, wiped out. We are now being forced to comply to conservative business models, where budgets, staffing, and resources are to be divided equally rather than equitably. It was long acknowledged by the system that alternative schools were providing essential spaces and opportunity for particular students, and thus had different needs. Yet in the past few years, there has been a move by the system to bring alternative schools and their staffing allocations more in line with mainstream schools. This change is slowly eradicating the foundations of alternative education in Toronto. And as we know tonight, more cuts throughout the system are on the way. Although all schools are struggling in these conservative times to find ways to engage and provide opportunities for marginalized, racialized youth, at Oasis, 100% of our students have been systematically marginalized. And in the words of one of our students, less staff means less hope. Last spring, when we learned that we would be losing one teaching position at the Arts and Social Change Satellite, the students were devastated. As a school where curriculum is based in equity and social justice, they wanted to know what they could do. How could they take action? First, a number of the students wrote letters to the director and chair of TDSB. Then, working with Oasis staff member Jocelyn Wickett, they integrated these letters into their culminating theater piece entitled Alternative Chances. You'll see excerpts of these letters in a moment. Although Oasis students did not benefit directly from their activism, they learned that when you take action, you can make change that affects the larger community. Some alternative schools did get some staff back through the activism. You will also see excerpts from a student-produced film entitled I'm Not a Freak, a piece of activist curriculum that gave students the opportunity to reflect on their schooling experiences before coming to Oasis. They perform their feelings about going to school, how they felt when they were there, and how they see themselves. Some of this may make us as educators uncomfortable, but there's so much we can continue to learn from listening closely to students' voices. My hope and my activism is ignited through the courage of students who take risks, ask hard questions, make changes, and produce work that is relevant and important to them. All the artwork in the excerpts you are about to see is student-produced. The power of this work is our hope.
Oasis?
It's different here. I feel great now. I don't have to worry about what people think.
I can be myself.
Everyone's open-minded and they understand me.
I'm free to express who I am.
I just feel comfortable.
Like I'm on the right path.
I still have trouble coming to school, but it's a lot better than before.
I still have the same issues at home, but now it's like this is a place to get away from them.
I'm doing much better and focusing in class more than I ever have. I went from 0 credits in a semester to 4 credits in a semester. 2 to 5.
1 to 4.
0 to 4, that's a 400% improvement than my last semester.
But not everyone understands alternative education.
Or what we do here.
Dear
Dr. Specs,
As a student of Oasis, I'm writing this letter to you because losing a teacher will affect me. Before I came to Oasis, I didn't attend school. The teachers at Oasis love to teach, and that makes me love to learn. They give us students support, security, and education. And losing a teacher is just another way of taking that away from us students. And a lot of us need that support and security to come to school and get an education. Please do not take a teacher away from us. With less staff, there's less hope.
Dear Dr. Spence, I was present at the school council meeting we had last night that went from 5 to 8. I heard a lot of things that made me upset and hurt. Our school is like a family that some of our at-risk students don't have. As a student, I have parents come to me to talk about how good they feel that for once they have a place where they can feel safe, but they'll have problems to get away from whatever goes on in their personal lives. Having fewer teachers means less credits offered, which means I'll probably have to leave earlier than I want.
Dear Dr. Spence, as the chair of the Triangle School Community Council...
Dear Dr. Spence, I am a teacher and curriculum leader at Oasis Alternative. I came to Oasis after working in various leadership positions in the TDSB Equity Department and teacher education at both York University and OISE. All of my educational experience has been focused on and through equity and social justice. I was overjoyed when I came back to the TDSB and landed softly at Oasis, a school whose vision, pedagogy, curriculum, and service provision are based on the equity principles congruent with my own. Cutting a staff position at Oasis will seriously jeopardize our ability to run a viable program across our 3 unique sites. We need enough of us to offer the credits our students need, to have a diverse staff who reflect our students' lived realities, to have enough adults in our program to diffuse conflict or violent situations, and to continue to reflect and innovate for the students who have not been successful anywhere else in the system. I am proud to be part of a school board that passed some of the most progressive equity and human rights policies in 1999. By reducing staff at the school, which serves the needs of some of the most marginalized, brutalized, and racialized youth in the city, undermines the spirit of the equity and human rights policies and the innovative work that you are currently engaged in to reduce the achievement gap. It is my sincere hope that you reconsider this decision.
When you were here before, couldn't look you in the eye. You're just like an angel. Your skin makes me cry. You float like a feather.
student trying to go to school, get my credits, and reach for my goal. But it's kind of hard when you have a bad past, when you're kind of homeless, or can't go home. I don't care if people call me a freak, I just feel sorry for them. Maybe I did a few stupid things in the past, and everyone makes mistakes, and we all want to own up to them.
I'm not a freak, I'm just a girl.
I'm not a freak, I just like to dress differently than everybody else.
I'm not a freak, I'm just a girl who makes mistakes.
Just as everyone else makes them.
I'm not a freak, I'm just a girl with a dream and the ambition to fulfill that dream.
I'm not a freak, I'm just a girl who likes to express her feelings and emotions, not through words, but through every other way.
I'm just your average teen trying to be successful in life, but it's hard when you're facing barriers and constantly being judged.
I'm not a freak, I just like to express my thoughts and emotions through sound and movement. I'm not emo because I'm emotional.
I'm not a freak, I'm a very artistic person. I am full of piercings, I am different, I am outgoing.
I'm not a freak, I'm just a student with addiction.
I'm not a slut, I just hit puberty faster than you. I'm not an addict, I
I'm
just
not
like
a
to
freak.
explore.
I just freak out. But who wouldn't? I mean, who doesn't? The school's full of freaking kids and freaking teachers. Everything is so hectic and fast. And in the hallway, everyone is freaking out to get to class. And in class, everyone is freaking out about the hall pass. But I'm not a freak. But what is everyone freaking out about? I don't even know, but now I gotta let it out. But don't be mistaken. I'm not a freak.
I'm not a freak.
I'm just me.
I'm a young father trying to correct his life. It's hard when he never took anything serious, especially school. Trying to give my son the best life I can is not an easy task at the age of 17.
Why do teachers call me a freak? Maybe because I'm always late, or I always get called down to the office, or I fight like every week. Maybe they need to know I have problems at home, and I have no place to take it out. Only at school. Sorry, everyone.
I wish I was special. You're so very special. But I'm a creep. I'm a widow. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here.
So Louise, thank you so much for that beautiful and powerful work. Thank you for bringing it to us. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Judy Rebick, who will present next. Judy Rebick is a well-known social justice activist, writer, educator, and speaker. She is currently the Eakin Fellow in Canadian Studies at McGill University. Previously, she held the CAW Sam Gindin Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Ryerson University. She is also part of the media panel on CBC Radio's Q. Her latest book is Transforming Power, From the Personal to the Political. Her other books include 10,000 Roses, The Making of a Feminist Revolution, and Imagine Democracy. She is currently working on a memoir of her life in the 1960s. Books authored by both Judy Rebick and James Banks are being made available for purchase by a different booklist in the lobby. She's the founding publisher of Rabble.ca, Canada's well-known independent online news and discussion site, and she is perhaps best known to Canadians as the former president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, Canada's largest women's group. That's how I remember you. During the 1990s, Judy was the host of two national TV shows on CBC News World and a frequent commentator on CBC radio and television. Please help me welcome Judy Rebick, who will present to us Occupy Education.
Thanks, Anessa. That's kind of weird. Can we, is there a way to turn those lights down? That light right there? Okay, so I can't see you, okay. So, well, I'm very happy to be here. I wasn't familiar until I got this invitation with the Center for Urban Schooling, and I'm just delighted that OISE is continuing to do the progressive work that it's always done over the years. Thank goodness it's still there, that's all I can say. Hopefully will continue for a long time to come. And I chose the top, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I've been in Quebec for 4 months, and one of the things I want to talk to you about is the Quebec student strike, which is one of the most extraordinary and wonderful things that's happened in this country in a long time. And I don't know if you can see, but I have this red square. Can you see it? On my supports the student strike wears on their clothing, and it's amazing. You walk down the streets of Montreal and like half the people, no, okay, I'm exaggerating. A quarter of the people are wearing it. And people have big red banners hanging from their balconies, and it's really something else, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so I called my talk Occupy Education. Actually, my last book isn't Transforming Power. My last book is an ebook called Occupy This, and it's the postcard telling you how to download it, because it's a little complicated, is also on the book table. And I wrote an ebook about Occupy This because last October, a friend of mine, Velcro Ripper's a filmmaker, he's been living in Brooklyn, he called me up and he said, I knew about Occupy Wall Street, of course, I started to follow it, and he said, Judy, this is so your thing, you have to come down here. And so I did. I took the plane and I went down to New York City and went to Occupy Wall Street. And I have to say, as many of you know, I've been an activist now, well, probably more than 40 years. And when I stepped into that site, I thought something, you know that old song that, I think it's Dusty Springfield, something's happening here? Yeah, well, that's how I felt. It's the first time since the 60s that I felt something very profound was changing. And so while we're living in increasingly conservative times, we're also living in potentially revolutionary times. And I really believe that's true, and that there's a new generation rising up all around the world to say no to a system which is benefiting only the 1%. And it's very exciting, and we're all going to be called upon in the next few years to decide what side of this battle we're on. And so I want to talk to you about why you should be on the side of the 99%, which seems evident, but self-evident, but isn't always so self-evident in every moment. And the other reason I called it Occupy Education is that Occupy is not just, I read Carol Gore's column today in the Star. Carol Gore's a progressive person, and she talks about how, she's talking about the success that Andrea Horwath had in pushing the liberal government to tax the rich, even if it's only 2%, and even if they define rich by those who make over $600,000 a year. I don't know, do you know anybody who makes over $600,000 a year? I guess there's some people who do, but still, it's a step ahead. And 78% of the population agree with taxing the rich. And that's because of Occupy. If you'd asked that question a year ago, that wouldn't have been true. But then she says, well, Occupy seemed to have so much promise, and now it's petered out, which is so crazy and not true at all. Occupy has been active all across the country, all across North America over the winter, but of course in a quieter way, and it's going to move out in a big way on May 1st. But the other thing about Occupy is a methodology. That's what's different about it. It's a methodology about change. My generation, and the reason I'm staying so long on one slide is because I was supposed to talk for 20 minutes and now I'm supposed to talk longer, so so I have to fill in a little bit. And the methodology in my generation, and I think also all the decades since then, our idea about change was we figured out what we want, we make a demand on the state, we organize, we demonstrate, we protest, we lobby, we educate, and we fight for that, and we never quite get that. But we usually get something approaching that, you know, so we wanted equal pay for work with equal value, and we got a law that was very bureaucratic, that said that, I don't even understand it, you know, but it's gonna say how, you know, all the different skills and profession and blah, 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 and it gets bureaucratized, right? But nevertheless, we won in this province very important pay equity legislation. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was something. And that is the way in which we have organized to fight. In the women's movement, we understood we also had to change our relationships with each other. And certainly in anti-oppression work, we understand that part of the change is changing our relationships with each other. But somehow that hasn't transformed into politics. You might have noticed that. Yes, all we need to do is go to question period to see that we haven't really progressed much past schoolyard battles of the 1950s in question period in Parliament, except there's maybe a few more women involved. So Occupy as a methodology is where you start is with your relationships. You don't start with demands. You start with your relationships with other people. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk about maybe starting the idea of what it is to be an activist somewhere else than the way we normally think of it. And I want to start from our successes. So, I knew this was going to happen. Okay. So, public education. You know, I was on a panel last week, not on a panel, I was moderating a panel last week in Ottawa, a CUPE National Conference. And Robert Fox from Oxfam said, Canada has more successfully defended public services than almost any other country in the world. We still have public health care, and we still have public education. And one of the reasons we still have public education is because of teachers. A big reason we still have public education is because of teachers and teachers' unions. And I'll remind you of the 1997 strike, of when teachers walked out to defend public education against the Visigoths in Queen's Park, who were really wanted to do their best to destroy public education. They didn't do it openly because they can't, it's got too much support. They did it sideways. They tried to do it sideways. And as much as they created a hell on earth for teachers in the province, that is Mike Harris, you know, my grandmother used to have a thing, whenever she said anything bad, she'd go, so Mike Harris. You remember him, I guess. Yeah, so as much as he did his best to create a hell on earth for teachers, you defended public education against his attempts to destroy it. And for that, and that was activism of the first order. And it took bravery for teachers to walk out when it was not exactly legal. I know the teachers' unions didn't want to call it an illegal strike, so I'll respect that. But it was not exactly legal. Let's put it that way. It was not a legal strike. It was what? It was an illegal strike. That's what I thought, but yes, it was an illegal strike. And teachers all across the province walked out on that strike. And they walked out not just to defend their jobs, but to defend public education for the students of that time and the students who came after. And it was a fantastic struggle. It really was. I mean, it was one of the proudest moments of my life, and I wasn't a teacher. I was just there at Queen's Park with the teachers. And so it's important to remember that way in which teachers organized to stand up against a particularly vicious government. And then I want to talk to you about, you know what that is? That's a demonstration of 200,000 people on March 22nd in Montreal. Okay. And mostly students. standing up against tuition hikes. Now, everybody, the neoliberal, everybody knows, everybody knows the term neoliberalism. That's what academics call corporate capitalism, or sometimes we call it neoconservatism. The idea that the private sector rules, the idea that everything in the private sector is good and everything in the public sector is bad. These ideas first came in when I was doing a CBC show called Face Off. This was a show where I every night debated Claire Hoy, who was the co-host, and right-wingers. And as I pointed out to somebody, I had shamefully admitted this is where Ezra Levant got his start, was a guest on our show. Anyway, 4 nights a week we debated these issues. And it's where I first heard these arguments like, oh yes, public sector workers sucking at the public teat. This was the thing, right? They're completely, so I would say, what about the police, you know? Aren't they public sector workers, right? But this propaganda about how the public sector is sucking on people's resources and giving us nothing in return, and you know, it's the private sector that creates wealth, and the private sector is more efficient than all of these arguments started then in the 90s. You know, Mike Harris brought it in with a sledgehammer, but it was coming in from every direction in the 90s, and also affecting education even beginning then. And in Quebec, the students refused to accept the logic of neoliberalism from very beginning. Every time the government wanted to raise tuition fees, the Quebec students went on strike, starting in the late 70s. Every time. And so, yes, they have the lowest tuition fees in Canada. In fact, tuition fees since that time in Ontario have gone up 207%. In Quebec, they've gone up 11%. And as an educator, I see the difference. You know, when I went to Montreal and started to teach at McGill, I was struck by the quality of the students. And at first I thought, well, it's because McGill's an elite school. And my brother said, careful, Judy, you're not supposed to think that. And I said, well, yeah, I taught at U of T, though, and it's sort of equivalent in terms of the quality of the school and how hard it is to get into, but I never had students like this. And I realized after a little while that the reason was that these students don't have to work as well as go to school. They're in the same position I was when I went to school, which is I could really, although mind you, I didn't do it, but I could have, had I chosen, really got into my education. I got into the McGill Daily, which was a different kind of education. And they're really engaged and into their education because, yeah, they have a summer job, but they don't have to work every night when they go home from school, or even balance the full-time job, which many of my students at Ryerson, which is much more of a working class university, have to work full-time and go to school full-time, because they still graduate with a big debt. And so the struggle of the students over the years to refuse this logic of neoliberalism, to refuse the argument that students and workers and poor people have to pay the price for economic crises, those students are out on the streets of Montreal again, but this time the government won't back down. The government is refusing to back down, figuring they'll give up. But today, well, when I left, there were almost 300,000 students, university students, college students, and there they have cégeps, which is an in-between high school. And high school students have also gone out, by the way, out on strike and closing down the streets of Montreal every single day with the most creative series of tactics you've ever seen. Just wonderful and joyous and powerful. You know, I thought, well, taxi drivers are going to be pretty pissed off at these students because you can't get around at all downtown anymore. You know, you get bulletins now instead of the traffic report. There's going to be a demonstration on Guy and Sherbrooke, you know, and the McGill administration, that's the most Orwellian experience I've ever had, sends out everyday emails. There's going to be a protest at the rotted gates. You might want to stay inside, you know, in case you might get touched by one of those protesters. So But no, the taxi drivers love the protests. Maybe it's because they get more money in their fares, I don't know, but I get the impression it's social. And the students, as the government got more and more belligerent in its opposition, its refusal even to talk to the students, the support grew for them. And the students started to say, it's not just about tuition. It's about austerity. Because, you know, what does it mean, an austerity budget, when you can spend $25 billion on a jet plane that we don't need? We don't need austerity. We need equality. We need income equality. We need to stop this trickling, rushing, you know, just trickle down, you know, oh yeah, if people on the top make money, it's going to trickle down to the rest of us. After all, they create jobs, yada, yada, yada. It ain't working. And Canada actually has the biggest economic income gap, the fastest growing income gap in the OECD. So if we think that we're immune to this, we're wrong. And so what we need is equality, more equality in the society, a fairer share of wealth in the society, a bit better public services, also more democratic. Not that the public services can't be improved, and I'll come to that. Better public services, not fewer public services. And that's what we need, but we're being sold the bill of goods. And the students in Quebec are naming, just as the Occupy people have, naming the elephant in the room. And that is that the majority of people are doing worse, and there's a small layer that's doing very, very well. And it's not fair. And it's not working. It's not working for anyone. And it's not business as usual. We're facing multiple crises. And I love capitalist eating the earth. It seems like a great image to me. So I talked about increasing inequality and, of course, environmental destruction, which, well, I'm really glad that Danielle Smith, I think that's her name, Danielle Smith, the leader of the Wild Rose Party in Alberta, lost. Although I got a tweet from a friend who's progressive who said, a positive step for Canada. I'm sorry, I just cannot accept that the victory of the Conservative Party in Alberta is a positive step for Canada. I can't even accept that having a woman leader and a woman leader of the opposition is a positive step for Canada. I'm sorry, I'm just too mad at all of them, you know, to even accept that there is some equity progress here. But so it's good that the people of Alberta understand that climate change is real, because like 99% of scientists do. I'm not sure our Prime Minister does, but we'll get to that. Environmental destruction. So we're in a system where even though the very survival of our species, not to mention hundreds and thousands of other species, is at stake. The survival of the planet Earth as we've known it. They can't change what they're doing. They seem incapable of changing what they're doing. Even when we have a massive crash, economic crash, in 2008, where the existing system so manifestly showed that it's failed, they can't change what they're doing. They seem incapable of changing what they're doing. So we're going to have to change it. That's all there is to it. The people of the world are going to have to change the way we're doing things, the way we share resources, the way we're taking care of the planet. Because the leaders, the politicians, just none of them, or almost none of them, seem capable of doing it. And that's why we're seeing the kind, and people are realizing it, which is why we're seeing the kind of social conflict we're seeing. So the first thing I want to say on environmental, how many people here know that almost 500,000 people marched in the streets of Montreal for Earth Day? Yeah. It was shut out of our media. The biggest demonstration on Earth Day anywhere in the world in Montreal. And it was not just environmentalists, because there'd been massive fights against fracking, you know, which is a destructive way of getting gas out of out of the St. Lawrence and against all kinds of attempts at land grabs in the north. And by the way, this is what McGinty's into, this is what Harper's into, and this is what Charest is into, that we're going to solve the economic crisis by destroying the wilderness through mining and clear cutting and oil and drilling for oil. That's what they're planning to solve the economic crisis. And we're going to have massive social conflict around this. You know, the Enbridge pipeline in BC and the huge uprising of indigenous people and local people and environmentalists against that. That's just the beginning. So we're seeing more and more, and in Europe what we're seeing is we see governments bringing in more and more austerity, and austerity, by the way, is part of the problem in Europe, yet they're bringing in more austerity, and the people are rising up against it. Everywhere, but the way that our media reports it is as if, you know, it's these crazy Greeks, you know, they just want longer vacations. But that's not what's happening. What's happening are people are saying no to this destructive system. And they're saying it in Europe, and they're saying it in New York and across the states now, and they're saying it in Quebec. So it's time for us to get on board, in my view. I talked about Occupy, and I said it starts with you. Occupy, the methodology of Occupy, it starts with you and your relationship. So for teachers, it starts with the teacher you want to be, being the teacher you want to be. And that's about I think it's about your relationship with your students. I've been teaching for a long time now, not, you know, at a post-secondary level. I started teaching, believe it or not, at University of Regina, because when I stepped down as president of NAC, they said, would you like to be a visiting professor? And I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I went, and I'd never taught before, except in the way that I teach, speaking and so on. And I went, and, you know, I thought I had to be an academic, and I learned from academics and so on. So I'm one of the lucky people that has basically been accepted into academia without any credentials whatsoever. Really, I have a BSc in psychology, and I got lousy marks, okay? So, but really, I found out something about teaching at McGill that I didn't fully understand. And I think it's because I probably didn't put enough of my thinking into teaching. And what happened was that I was teaching a class on the history of second wave feminism, and about a third of the class was in gender studies at McGill, and the rest of the class wasn't in gender studies. And when the McGill Faculty of Arts voted against striking, but gender studies voted to strike. It's a particular thing in you know, we don't have strikes, student strikes, but in the history of student strikes, different departments vote on striking. Different programs, they can vote on striking. So a number of the departments at McGill, or the programs, voted to strike, and one of them was gender studies. So I thought, okay, well, my politics are, if my students want to strike, I'm going to cancel a class. First of all, I don't want to walk across a picket line, even if it's a soft picket line, or they're going to disrupt my class. And secondly, I believe in what they're doing. I think it's really important, especially at McGill, to be part of the Quebec student movement. But on the other hand, more than half my class, they didn't participate in the vote to strike. So I started to feel, well, if I cancel a class, it's kind of an abuse of my power as a teacher, because they didn't decide to go on strike. So how is it my decision to cancel the class when they want to learn, they want to go to the class? So I was really stressed out about this. And I talked to a couple of people, and finally decided to do was I'd hold a class to talk about whether we should cancel the class. And they were picketing my class, so we couldn't go in the class, so I said, well, can we hold it on the steps? So that's what we did. We held the class on the steps of the McGill Institute for Studies in Education, which is a very august building, and you know, I made sure no one in the staff minded. They were all supportive of the strike, so they didn't mind. And it was great, you know, like the strikers spoke, and then somebody who opposed the strike, who happened to be auditing the class, so she didn't have anything to lose. She spoke very strongly why we shouldn't cancel the class, and we had a great discussion. It was really educational. I didn't say much. I didn't want to, I didn't want to intervene. And we held a secret vote, and all but one person voted to cancel the class. Of course, I wound up doing way more work because I had to be in my office, and they would come in and talk to me one-on-one or two-on-one, and that was okay. But that was okay. It felt great. But for me, it was like I needed to talk to them about it, to let them have power over the decision. And that's something I think that as teachers is something very hard to negotiate, which is as teachers, whether we're, and it's even more true at a secondary level, but it's certainly true at university, as teachers, we have a lot of power. As educators, we have a lot of power in the classroom. Even if we feel in our lives we have no power, in the classroom, we have a lot of power. And some of us aren't comfortable with that. Some of us like it. But whether we like it or not, like judiciously using that power is the beginning, I think, of occupying education and transforming education. Seeing education not as, and I know the people in this room already understand critical pedagogy, but not as the banking system of, we're the expert depositing knowledge in the brains of our students, but rather seeing it as a relationship. I know the things that I learned in my life were not from formal education, most of them. I said as a joke, like I didn't go to class. Last year, McGill, I didn't even go to class. I spent my time at the McGill Daily. And that's where I learned how to write. It's where I learned how to be an activist. It's where I learned how to stand up for myself and for other people, which, are kind of what set me on my path in my life. It wasn't in my classroom except for one class. And that was a class with a guy named Gad Horowitz, who you might have heard of. And the main reason was because he wanted us to call him Gad. And this was so revolutionary in 1967, I can't tell you. And we had a whole discussion about why we should call him Gad instead of professor. And it was about the question of power in the classroom. And he didn't want the kind of power he had, and he wanted to take down the barriers. Now, I try and get my students to call me Judy, and they all call me professor anyway. But that's okay, that's their choice, right? But I think that developing a relationship with students is key. And being the teacher you want to be is key. One of the things, I was talking to Amy Gottlieb about this earlier, I've been fighting racism and sexism and homophobia my whole life, as long as I can remember. Not my whole life, but at least since I was 22. And in doing that, what we want to do is we want to create a society where we all can participate fully, where we all can have the richness of all of our experiences in our society, where everyone feels valued and like they belong. But unfortunately, because a lot of the demands that we make get kind of funneled into this patriarchal, capitalist, colonialist society that we live in, it becomes punitive. So, if I say something wrong, I remember, better check the time here. I remember when I was, we were organizing International Women's Day in the 80s, and the first time a lot of union women came, working class women came. Now, these are women who worked in a factory with men, what they had to put up with in terms of sexism and standing up to the guys, and, these were amazing feminists, right? But didn't know the lingo so well, right? And one of the women said, girl. Now, today, girl is accepted as but then it was like, it was a sin for a feminist to say girl. And I use that word judiciously. And this whole crowd just jumped on her and made her feel unwelcome, when she was probably one of the strongest feminists in the room in terms of her actual practice, right? And so that idea that we punish people for sexism or racism instead of educating them, instead of talking to them, instead of finding out what's going on, instead of building relationships, instead of getting to know each other, instead of learning from each other. That's part of, I think, what we have to change. And we can do it in the classroom, because nobody is in there telling us what to do. Well, they're telling us what to do over here, but you can maneuver and manipulate around that, I think. At least I kind of spend my life doing that. So, but how we are in our classroom, and I said this about Occupy too, because Occupy is a whole new set of people, and a lot of them are white men who've never been part of what I call, don't know the grammar of equality. They've never been part of any of these struggles, and they think that they're without prejudice. The kind of we are one, right? I even had, when I did a launch of Occupy This in Montreal, and all men got up at the mic, and it drives me crazy, So I made a crack about 40 years of feminism, and still it's all men getting up at the mic. Aren't there any women who want to talk, And this guy gets up at the mic and he says, I don't see gender. Yeah. So I've heard people say, I'm colorblind, but I never heard anybody say, I don't see gender. Like, isn't that kind of the first thing we see, right? So anyway, these guys, and there's quite a few of them, that's what they feel. They feel they're treating people equally, which of course they're not, and therefore everybody's equal. We don't need, women's caucuses or people of color caucuses. We don't need anti-oppression policy and so on. But the initial thing is education. And then of course there's a few hardliners who won't change, and then you have to deal with that. So I think that being the teacher you want to be is about being the human being you want to be, and listening and talking and developing relationships with students. Because one of the things is, and this is something I had to learn, it was a hard lesson, was that when you start to listen, you start to learn a lot yourself, including with students. Because I know I have a 4-year-old niece and a 1.5-year-old nephew, great niece and great nephew, and I learn a ton from them. And they're like only 1.5 and 4. So when they get to be like 12 and 13, they're just, geniuses really in comparison, and have a wealth of experience, but also they can teach us how to teach. And I felt that a lot in my class. I'm sure you know more about this than I do. And then it comes to, what is your dream of education? Not just who you want to be as teacher, but what is your dream of education? And that's about changing the system. And one of the things that happened in the women's movement was women's studies. I want to talk about 2 transformational experiences that we tried to have. One is women's studies. When I was in university, anybody remember the card system in libraries, when there were cards? Yeah. So if you went into the McGill Library and you looked under W for woman, there would be nothing there. Nothing there. That is true. In 4 years of university, I only studied one book written by a woman, and it was George Eliot. So I figured somebody didn't realize, So women's studies set out to create a body of knowledge about women. And this, women's studies did magnificently. It's revolutionary what they accomplished. And not just in women's studies, but in every discipline. Every discipline has studied gender now. But the other thing we set out to do was to overturn the patriarchy in academia, to change the top-down kind of guild feudal system that exists in academia. And this we almost totally failed to do. In fact, I would have said until a few weeks ago that most women's studies programs have gotten co-opted inside that system, because in order to do well, you have to participate in it. In order to become valued as an academic, you have to participate in it and write these articles that 12 other people read. And if you write an article that maybe 200 people might want to read, then you're undervalued for that. So you'll excuse me, academics. I think there's good things about academe, but also there's some very bad things. So we failed to do that. We failed to change the system. But at Concordia and McGill, the only two faculties in which all of the professors are supporting the striking students are women's studies. So that made me feel really good. So maybe we haven't totally been co-opted. And so the other example that I want to give is NAC, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, which I was glad to hear the applause. I mean, NAC barely exists now. But it was, in the 90s, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the most powerful women's group, not only in Canada, but I think in the world. National Women's Organization. Not only did NAC successfully fight on a series of issues and win equality for women, including equality in the Constitution, supporting to win legal abortion, childcare pay equity, employment equity, a whole series of things which having a powerful women's movement, which was structured at the federal level as NAC helped to do. But it also played a huge role in a number of national debates, like bringing in women's interests in the debate on free trade, the debate on the Constitution, the debate on Aboriginal self-government, which of course the Native Women's Association of Canada did, but NAC supported them in doing it. But NAC at a certain point, when the government turned to the right, in the Mulroney government, I mean, now Mulroney looks like a positive communist compared to what we got now, but at the time he was represented a move to the right. A lot of the women that came to me and asked me to run. And, I was surprised because people like Doris Anderson, Norma Scarborough, who I saw at the time as very middle class and liberal and so on, they asked me to run because I was known as a fighter in the pro-choice movement. And they realized that with a right-wing government, we had to have a fighting women's movement. So they wanted me to be president of NAC. And we were a fighting women's movement. I mean, we did amazing things. But one of the amazing things we did was that at the time in the 80s, women of color were fighting for a voice in the women's movement. And it was a fight. It started here in Toronto I should wind up, right? Sorry, I should wind up soon. Somebody, yeah. It started in Toronto in the anti-violence groups because that was where most women of color were working. It moved into International Women's Day, and then it moved into NAC. And we had to figure out and we were really, in a way on the cutting edge of the fight against racism or anti-oppression, whatever you want to call it, in Canada. And as we should have been, since we were a movement that talked about equality. And if it was only equality for white middle-class women, it wasn't equality. And we kind of figured that out under a lot of pressure from women of color and poor women, and working-class women too. And then we had to figure out how to restructure the organization, because how do you have mandatory affirmative action in an organization where everybody's a volunteer, for example? And we did. We figured it out. We had designated spots in the executive. And after I stepped down as president of NAC, Sunira Tabani became president of NAC, a woman of color. And it was controversial inside and outside the organization, and there was amazing racism. Like, it stunned me, it didn't stun her, of course, she was used to it. Although I think it surprised even her. And, people say NAC, a lot of people used to say NAC was destroyed by the fight against racism in NAC, but that's not true. On the contrary, I think NAC survived another 10 years because of that fight, because what it meant was more women of color started to get involved with NAC, more working class women started to get involved with NAC, and made it a more radical organization, a more relevant organization to the majority of people in this country. To this day, I have taxi drivers who remember me, South Asian taxi drivers who remember me because of that fight, because Sunira became president of NAC and because I supported her. Because that meant the world to the South Asian community, to the Chinese community, the Black community, that there was at least one organization in this country that recognized that this was not a white country. This was a diverse country, and that there was a lot of talent in all the new immigrants who had come in and the black people who had been here way longer than most of the white people who have been here in Nova Scotia and Southern Ontario, and that we were including them. And they were leading us and doing a good job of it too, by the way. We were a little ahead of our time. But it wasn't because of the fight against racism. It was because of the impact of neoliberalism that NAC declined. That was the reason. Because the women's movement was based on working in a welfare state, in a state where the public good was understood, in a state where at least there was some distribution of wealth. And everything we wanted and demanded, almost everything except for formal legal rights, depended on that. And we couldn't win that anymore. And they also saw us as a big threat to that neoliberal agenda, a big threat. And so they set out to destroy us too, funding cuts and so on and so forth. And we didn't have enough of a consciousness to fight back, but we do now. We do now because we have a lot more experience. So there's two things I want to say to you, which is one, it was worth it. We lost that organization, but we transformed the women's movement. So today, if you go to an International Women's Day, the majority of people marching are people of color. And not only women marching, but their whole communities are supporting those marches and those demands. And you're here, right? And there's a Center for Urban Schooling at OISE, right? That's talking about including marginalized people. And NAC was an important part of that change that happened in Canada. So it was worth it. So, you know, the people say to me, I'm going to skip that because we don't have time. The barriers to activism. What are the barriers to activism? And the first one is always fear. The first one is always fear. Oh, we're going to lose our organization. We're going to lose our funding. Somebody's going to be mad at me. Somebody's going to think I'm stupid or silly or foolish. So I say there's some real fears. You know, I can tell you that I probably would have made a lot more money if I hadn't been an activist. For sure. You know, I would have like a secure retirement now, which I don't have. I even got fired from a job. Not fired because the CBC doesn't fire people, but, you know, marginalized so that I didn't want to be there anymore because of my politics. So that's a real fear, and that's a choice you have to make, and you make it more than once in your life. What's more important? Is your career more important, your job more important, or this issue that you're working on, this piece of activism? It doesn't happen very often, usually just if you're high profile like me, or if you're working on an issue that is particularly problematic to certain people, like, let's say, Palestinian rights, or if you're in the Catholic school board and you're a pro-choice activist. It's not a real fear, usually. Oh. Great, we can have a dialogue. Coming right up, eh? Okay, I'm going to wind up real fast. So all I want to say about fear is, you know, courage is overcoming fear. You know, people used to call me fearless. I used to be fearless because I had a mental problem. You know, I was dissociated. Nobody's fearless unless they're dissociated. And like soldiers learn to be dissociated, or cops learn to be dissociated. Courage is overcoming fear. And in this country, nobody's going to shoot you for being an activist, at least not yet. You know, compared to other countries, we have freedom of speech. We have the freedom to be activists. And if we don't take it, we'll lose it, especially now. So I'd say with fear, I understand the fear a little bit. You know, I hear it a lot. You have to overcome it. You have to step in. And when you do, there's such joy in that, really, such joy in standing up for what you believe in doing what you believe in, that the next time it's easier. And then the other antidote to fear is solidarity. And so I'm going to end up here, even though which is an isolation, is solidarity. And the number of people in this room who've come to a conference on activism in education tells you you're not alone. There's a lot of people, way more than you think. I know this every time I go on cue. Way more than we think, because the media doesn't reflect what we think, our politicians don't reflect what we think. But really, I believe a majority of people in this country want a fairer, more equitable society, want to preserve public education and other public services, but they'd like to be more involved. They'd like it to be more democratic. They'd like it to reflect more what they need and what their children need. And that's part of what we can do by listening, by being empathetic and sympathetic, and by standing up for what we believe in and supporting our students when they stand up for what they believe in. Thank you.
Welcome, James Banks. And thank you so much, Judy, for your speak. I'm going to introduce you to James Banks, and he's going to do a presentation, and we're going to give him time. James Banks holds the Carrie and Linda Killinger Endowed Chair in Diversity Studies and is founding director of the Center for Multicultural Education at the University of Washington, Seattle. He was the Russell F. Stark University Professor from 2001 to 2006. Professor Banks is a past president of the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and of the National Council for the Social Studies. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the AERA. Professor Banks is a specialist in social studies education and in multicultural education, and has written more than 100 articles and written or edited 20 books in these fields. Professor Banks received the AERA Research Review Award in 1997, the AERA Social Justice Award in 2004, and the Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages Incorporated President's Award in 1998. He received the Distinguished Career Research and Social Studies Award from the National Council for the Social Studies in 2001, the UCLA Medal in 2005, and a Distinguished Alumni Award from Michigan State University in 2005. He was a Spencer Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford in 2005-2006. Professor Banks was the Tisch Distinguished Visiting Professor at Teachers College, Columbia University in 2007. His books have been translated into several languages. Please help me welcome Dr. James Banks.
Vanessa, thank you kindly for the kind introduction. There is a God. I'll tell you my story during the reception, but I'm pleased to be here because I thought this was the one speech I wasn't going to give. I've been on the road for 40 years and I've made them all, through snow and through today a heart attack on the plane. A man on the plane had a heart attack. I would like to thank Vanessa for the kind introduction. I am pleased and honored to have an opportunity to speak with you this evening, I guess it is now. The title of my talk is Educating Citizen in Global Times for Knowing, Caring, and Acting. The diversity within nations around the world present both challenges and opportunities to educators. First, I will describe the challenges of diversity in global times, and then the opportunities it provides educators. We are living in difficult times. More than ever, we need thoughtful, active, and committed citizens who will act to make their nations and their world more just and humane. Hard times at home and abroad test a nation's values and resolve. The histories of groups such as African Americans, First Nations people in Canada, and the struggles of Indigenous people around the world teach us that out of desperations come hope, and out of oppression come possibilities, and that even dark times provides an opportunity to affirm our commitment to human freedom and to social justice. The trouble and challenging times in which we live require educators and citizens who have a vision and a deep commitment to values such as justice and equality, values that were at the heart of the civil rights movement and of the dream of which Martin Luther King Jr. spoke so eloquently, and which President Obama referred to in his inaugural address in January 2009. We are living in difficult times that try our souls. Schools, colleges, and universities need to address issues of social justice, in addition to teaching the basic skills. In nations around the world, such as Canada, the US, the United Kingdom, the focus has shifted to a focus on teaching basic skills in a movement toward social cohesion, and with less focus on diversity and multicultural issues. In the US, the focus on basic skills is required by the No Child Left Behind Act that was passed by the US Congress and signed by President Bush in 2002. This is a very important issue today, this basic skills versus social issues, because of the problems that the US and the world face, including the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the threats to democracy around the world, global warming, the AIDS, HIV crisis, and genocides. Schools are also facing many problems today and trying to figure out how to increase basic skills in reading, writing, and math. All students, of course, need to master basic skills in reading, writing, and math. However, these skills are necessary but not sufficient. I am deeply concerned about an education that is narrowly defined as academic achievement and basic skills. We should be educating students to be moral, reflective, and active citizens in a troubled world. The world's greatest problems result not from people not being able to read and write. The world's most momentous problems result from people in the world, from different cultures, races, religions, and nations, being unable to get along and to work together to solve the world's problems, such as global warming, poverty, racism, sexism, and war. Examples of the conflict between the Western and Arab nations, North Korea and its neighbors, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Clearly, numeracy and literacy are essential for citizens in a democratic society in a global world. However, they are not sufficient. Some of the most unconscionable acts that have been committed in the world have been done by highly literate nations and cultures. Germany was one of the most literate nations in the world when its leaders presided over the death of 12 million innocent people, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and 6 million other targeted groups, including people with disabilities and people who were gay. And this occurred in the land of Beethoven, of Bach, and Max Weber. This was high civilization, and yet they committed these atrocities. So clearly, just knowing is not enough, not sufficient. The people in Germany knew a lot. I mean, they led music with Beethoven and Bach. They led the world in sociology with Max Weber, but yet they committed atrocities. Many years ago, A young principal put this letter in the mailboxes of all of his teachers on the first day of school. It said, "Dear teacher, I am the survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no human should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and bodies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, and educated Eichmanns." That's the end of the quote. Back to my own words, reading, writing, and arithmetic are important if they only help to make students more humane. This is a letter. This is a letter that young principal gave to his new teachers every year. In addition to teaching the basic skills, we need to educate students for actions, for citizenship, and to care. This is an education that educates not only students' heads, but also their hearts. By a cultural and global citizenship education for social justice, I mean an education that teaches students to know, to care, and to act. And I don't know if I know how to move this, but it's just like mine, so I guess I do know how to use it. An important goal of this kind of education is to teach students to know, to care, and to act. I will return to these three ideas later in my presentation. In nations throughout the world, there is increasing diversity as well as an increasing recognition of diversity. Worldwide immigration, globalization, the quest by marginalized and structurally excluded groups for educational equality, and documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have focused attention on diversity and democracy in nations around the world. And this diversity is happening all around the world. And I'm skipping around because I want to get you out of here at 8. I'm skipping around to give you an abbreviated version of my talk. That we have diversity around the world. As a matter of fact, my latest research focuses on looking at diversity around the world. And my latest book, the Encyclopedia of Diversity and Education, deals with diversity around the world. I have flyers on that. If any of you want to pick them up, you can do so after the session. First, there's religious diversity, which we see France, for example, is struggling with the largest Muslim population in Europe, and they're not doing such a good job. So these are challenges that we see around the world, and I just wanted you to see some of these figures, that the number of people living outside the nation of birth or citizenship grew from 120 million in 1990 to 160 million in 2000. In 2008, there were 200 million migrants, which was 3% of the world's population of 7 billion. So these issues are happening all over the world, and we use different terms for this new development. Flexible citizenship, Awa Ong, that's the word she used, professor of anthropology at Berkeley. Will Kimlicka, here in your own country, at Queen's University, that's in Toronto, isn't it, or near? I've never been there, I've just read his work. And Will Kimlicka has been kind enough to contribute to several of my books. So that these issues are being faced by all nations. And what is the goal we need to do? We need to balance unity and diversity. We can't just have diversity, and we just can't have unity. If we only have unity, that's what happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. It doesn't work. That's what happened in the Soviet Union during the Soviet Union years. Just unity. What so-called social cohesion. It only it marginalized minority groups. but we need a delicate balance of unity in diversity in order to, for citizens to be effective, in order to, and I'm getting ahead of my power, I'm going to rely heavily on the PowerPoints because I'm abbreviating my talk. We need a delicate balance of cultural, regional, and national identification. And this should be an essential goal of a school in a multicultural society. In other words, what I'm arguing is that we need to respect kids' cultural identities. And of course, we need to respect and of course, they have to have a national identity because you're reminded when you cross, I just got through customs, and you're reminded, when people say the nation state, the day is over for the nation state, I said, I was in Canada last week too. I was at the AERA. How many of you were there? Some of you were. And every time you go when you come to the United States, if you think nation state doesn't matter, come to the United States. Or come to Canada if you're an American. So national identity is significant. And we'll be talking more about that in the session. But it's not sufficient. We also have to have kids develop global identifications and regional identifications. But I want to talk, what have schools, not only in Canada, but in the US and Australia and Europe and England, what have schools traditionally done? Rather than enhance and support the identities of minoritized students, they have stripped kids of their identities. And that's led to what some social scientists have called led to an issue that's really caused ethnic groups to focus on their individual identities and not on the national identity or the global identity. When you do not give what Amy Gutman calls recognition to a student, but Amy Gutman calls that recognition. What does she mean by that? Recognizing their language, their culture in the school. When you do not give students recognition, what happens? Do they identify with the nation state? No. They don't see themselves reflected in the nation state. But for example, the Muslim kids who were convicted for bombing the subways in England were British citizens in Leeds, but they didn't feel a part of Britain. They didn't feel a part of the nation state. So that students need to feel a part of the nation state. And how do we do that? By recognizing their cultural identities. And let me talk about how we have not done that in the various nations. Mexican Americans were punished for speaking Spanish in schools. In Canada, Indians were put in Canadian Indian residential schools, by the way, which Canada has apologized for, just as Australia has apologized to the Aborigines for putting them in state schools. So we need a delicate balance of these identifications if we are to promote citizenship and active involvement of all of our citizens. We also need to develop cosmopolitanism, what Martha Nussbaum calls cosmopolitanism, to help students understand that they need to not just identify with their own nation, their own culture, and their own families, but they need to identify with the global community. And Nussbaum calls that cosmopolitanism. And so does Appia. He talks about growing up really with his father teaching him that he needed to think of his relationship not only with his own cultural group, but the culture group. One of the important points that Nussbaum and Appia make is that you can't strip people of their first identity and expect them to reach out to others. That the first identity is really important. Jim Banks, an African American, needs to feel comfortable in being a Black American before I can reach out to Jewish Americans or Latino Americans. I need to be comfortable with who I am before I can reach out to others. And that's really the point that Appia and Nussbaum are making, that we can't expect people to be, to really reach out to others until they can accept self. They need to accept self. Let me move on to the final part of my talk, is that we need to teach kids to know, to care, and to act. Let me start out to knowing, about teaching students to know. That's the first thing we need to do in order to make them active citizens. We need to teach them to know. And what do I mean by to know? I mean to know from different perspectives. And I'll give an example of a unit that I teach my teacher educators, the westward movement. First of all, westward for whom? It wasn't westward for the Indians, for the Native Americans, because they were already living in the West. So for them, it was the center of the universe. It wasn't westward for the Mexicans, it was north. It wasn't westward for the Japanese, it was east. So the westward, this notion, and it wasn't westward for the Alaskans, it was south. So what we're trying to help teachers understand, that the notion of the West is a very ethnocentric Anglo-American concept. So that when I say teach kids to know, I'm trying to get them to understand that the very notion, the words we use need to be deconstructed, need to be analyzed. So when we say things like the westward movement, which sounds very innocent, or the other phrase that you often see in Anglo-American history is that the West was a wilderness. And I ask my students to deconstruct that term. What does that mean? What is the political implication of the term that the West was a wilderness? Or this whole notion about pioneers and settlers. I do an exercise, and if I had time, I'd do it with you. You can think about doing this with a colleague. One of you can be a native person in the West, and you can ask, what are different words that the native person has for the pioneers and the settlers? Why don't we do that for 60 seconds? What are words that the native person, the Indians, might call the pioneers and settlers? And I did this with one group, not only invaders, but they said undocumented immigrants. So we need to teach students to know. And one of the things before I go on to act, I want to talk about bringing women into history. When we teach about social action, we need to bring women into history because they've been as excluded from Black and brown history as they have from Anglo history. So that, and I give this example from Rosa Parks. People say she didn't give up her seat because she was tired. But yet when we asked Rosa Parks, she said, people always say that I was tired, but I was not tired. Or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me of being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. So if we bring Rosa Parks' view into history, we have to rethink history, reconceptualize it. So bringing the voice of women, their perspectives, make us rethink history. Secondly, to know, to care, and to act. What about acting? Knowing and caring is important, but citizens must also act if they are to be effective participants in a democratic and caring society. Dante said that the worst place in hell is reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis take a neutral stand. Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. Audre Lorde, one of my heroes, and whose work, if you don't know, you should read, Audre, L-O-R-D-E, she said that silence will not protect you. Some people just say, I'm not going to get involved. But Lorde said that silence will not protect you. Martin Luther King his life exemplified knowing, caring, and acting. When he became actively involved in resisting the Vietnam War, King was harshly criticized by both blacks and white in America. And this was a very difficult time for him. We hear a lot about the dream speech, but we don't teach about all the hell that King caught when he opposed the Vietnam War. And kids need to learn not only the dream speech, but they need to learn the difficulties that he underwent. And when he was being harshly criticized for the Vietnam War, he gave one of the most powerful speeches, one of his last speeches that he gave. He said, "It is my deep conviction that justice is indivisible, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. For those who tell me I'm hurting the civil rights movement and ask, don't you think that to be respected and in order to gain support, you must stop talking about the war? I can only say that I'm not a consensus leader. I do not seek to determine what is right and wrong by taking a Gallup poll to determine the majority opinion. On some position, the coward asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience must ask the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. And that is where I find myself today. King also said, we will live together as brothers and sisters, or die separate and apart as strangers. I will end with the words of James Baldwin, one of my heroes and a great writer, one of the greatest writers of the last century. In a letter in 1971 that James Baldwin wrote to Angela Davis, who was a political prisoner in California, Baldwin stated why it is important for us to teach students to act in order to maintain a civil and caring society, and to act to maintain social justice. He said in this letter, if we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they come for you in the morning, they will come for us that night. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, James Banks and Judy Rebick again. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we do not have time for questions and commentary, as the university is very strict about us leaving here on time. Unless we want to occupy here. I want to thank both of our speakers and guests, and I want to really thank James Banks for coming here from the airport, because we had a lot of back and forth about saying, really, do I have to come here directly from the airport? And we thought you were going to have time to go back to your hotel, but you made it over here, so thanks. We really appreciate it. And thank you, And thank you, Judy Rebick, for giving us more of your time and really, I'm serious, and really kind of explaining to us and filling out what the Occupy movement and what the implications are, and really giving us a model of what's going on in Montreal and giving us a lot to think about here in Toronto. So thank you very much for that. I'm leaving this evening really rethinking what it means for me to be an educator. And I just want to repeat 3 of the phrases that our speakers gave us this evening to help us rethink. First, Judy said, be the teacher that you want to be. And one of the things I'm taking away for that, and being the teacher I want to be, and one of the things that I talk with my students all the time about, is being the teacher I want to be without fear. What does it mean for us to be the teachers we want to be in the absence of fear? And what is your dream of education? And can you dare to dream about education beyond the district policies and the EQAO scores that we are encouraged to be the center of our dreams? And then James Banks reminded us and gave us a lot to think about in terms of building a global citizenship with our students, teaching kids to know. And knowing is beyond literacy and numeracy scores. Knowing is beyond literacy and numeracy scores. Knowing is beyond literacy and numeracy scores. To care and to act. This has given me a lot to think about. I don't teach in K-12 schools, I teach at the graduate level, but I want to tell you, I'm leaving here thinking a lot of what this means for my teaching at the graduate level and the undergraduate level as well. So thank you again, everyone, for being patient, and it's great to kind of go with the flow. It feels so exciting. There's lots of books outside to sign. There are kind of ebooks to download. There are books. There are tools to use in your schools. There are books to guide and to help us rethink our curriculum. So please take part in the conversations that may go on, and thank you very much.